The Joe Rogan Experience.
But anyway, so I mean, I asked Lula directly. I said, and I actually wrote an article for a left-wing magazine at the time. I said, are you going to try to turn Brazil into Cuba and have censorship? And he said, absolutely not. Our socialism is going to be democratic socialism. And that was my attraction to Brazil too, was that, and to the Workers' Party and to Lula. I mean, he was he had all the stuff that you loved about the left, but he was going to respect free speech. So I, basically after the Tour Files Brazil and the Workers' Party, and Lula just start defending censorship, then I start going after Lula too. And I'm like, you lied to me, and this is,
what do you think changed?
Unacceptable. Wow, great question. I mean, there's a way in which it's the same thing that changed for the left everywhere. I mean, this is the question we're always asking, which is like,
how?
I mean, because if you read the histories, I'm now, by the way, we're going to spend 3 months in Austin every year now because I'm the CBR chair of politics, censorship, and free speech at the University of Austin.
Oh.
I'm the first and only endowed chair there. So it's exciting. So I'm here and...
Well, welcome.
Thank you, man. I'm really... Yeah, we just bought a little house and...
Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
So, yeah, I mean, because of course, if you read the histories of free speech, particularly the last couple hundred years, it's really the right censoring the left. Right. There's a few exceptions, but I mean, overwhelmingly, all the way back to the original, French Parliament where they split, the French Congress, where they split people left and right, became a way to refer to liberals and conservatives. Conservatives were about protecting tradition, about propriety, don't say certain things. That was like what conservatives were. And then if you go to the United States, like one of the most dramatic instances of censorship here is the early part of the 20th century with the Sedition Act, and that's when they were, arresting socialists, incarcerating thousands of people. I mean, it's a crazy period. And so that's basically the tradition. That's why when we were, in the 90s and up until recently, free speech was part of the left tradition. So what happened? I mean, what's clear about the censorship that's going on is it's counter-populist. So they're going at Jair Bolsonaro, like Trump, is a populist candidate. So one thought experiment would be, if Bernie Sanders had become president in 2016, would the deep state have sided with? Would they have sided with the right, with the Republicans, to censor a populist Democratic Party? It's an interesting question. I don't know the answer to it. Clearly, I mean, I would say if you look at what the global elite, which is kind of a center-left elite in Europe, Brazil, United States, Canada, it really wants to censor on COVID, elections, and migration. And they do the mass migration stuff around hate. So like if you criticize mass migration, it's hate speech and you should be censored. So clearly this is a reaction by the deep state against populism, which clearly threatens them, their ability to build a wage war when they want to wage war, to move people around. I mean, it's huge. I mean, the mass migration that's been occurring under Biden, of course, has been happening in Europe too. And everybody's like, what's going on? Like, why is this happening?
Why do you think it's happening?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, obviously, the traditional story had been that this is compassionate and, this is the right thing to do and want to bring people in. There's so many. I mean, the Democrats and the Europeans, they went so far with it that it actually it's hurt them politically. Like, Kamala may lose the elections because of just the mass migration. It was like the number one thing 60 Minutes asked her about just now. In Germany, the AfD, which is considered the far-right party, far just means anti-mass migration. So they went really far. I mean, I think there's probably some truth to the idea that Democrats are bringing in folks to increase Democratic voters. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's something that, John Judas and Rui Teixeira wrote a whole book about called The Emerging Democratic Majority, where they talked about how Latinos are going to side with Democrats. And then another part of me just wonders if it's related, is that there was a concern that populism, because I mean the threat of populism is that it's popular. So the threat of populism is that the people actually govern rather than these deep state organizations that have constrained, that pre-internet constrained what was acceptable. They narrowed the so-called Overton window. With populism, you get potentially populations that say we don't want to go to war in Ukraine. We don't want to, support foreign wars. We don't want to have mass migration, and for a variety of reasons, these deep state organizations, by which I mean, Department of Homeland Security, FBI, CIA, State Department, are absolutely freaked out about it, as are the kind of global elite that end up supporting the NGOs pushing for that same agenda. George Soros, Craig Newmark, Pierre Omidyar, the people that basically end up financing the NGOs that the U.S. government then comes along and finances, which by the way is another thing that we keep discovering. Like, we'll be in Brazil and we'll be like, wow, these NGOs are doing the exact same thing in Brazil that they're doing in Europe. Oh, and they happen to be funded by George Soros. They happen to have a fact-checking groups that come along and fact-check as a pretext for censorship. They do advertiser boycotts against the social media companies in order to control the social media companies. Obviously, there was this huge infiltration of Twitter. I mean, since I saw you last, we discovered what basically looks like a CIA effort to take over the content moderation at Twitter. It was former CIA people, Alethea Group, which basically was, we discovered these internal memos where they're basically trying to come in and create a special new content moderation, which is, of course, code for censorship.
How did they frame that?
They framed it, it's so fascinating because, of course, we can see all the memos and we have it, so it's not a theory. They were addressing... They basically were in the sales pitches from this Alethea Group. They were selling they were basically hyping the criticisms that Twitter was getting for not censoring enough. And then they were saying, well, we're going to bring all this intelligence experience, and we've got these people that are really skilled at foreign languages. I mean, they were promising to bring in people that spoke all these different languages. And there was some internal resistance within Twitter, but it basically was on track to happen. And then Elon buys Twitter, and it all
What do you think would have
ends.
happened if he didn't buy it?
I mean, honestly, sometimes I'm careful. I don't want to engage in hyperbole, but I do feel like what we're seeing is totalitarianism. That this is, it's not tanks and torture chambers, at least not yet. But this instinct, this demand to control the entire information environment, because of course the censorship is in service of actually propaganda. They both want to prevent certain information from getting out, and then they want to promote certain information. And this is, when I just reread 1984 by George Orwell, and it's like, this is what he's talking about. This is what he's worried about.
So do you think when social media first came along, they sort of underestimated the potential and they let it become what it is, and then once it got so huge, then they tried to infiltrate, like perhaps after 2016, then they tried to infiltrate and kind of realized it's a little too late because there's just too many people like yourself and Substack people and podcasters. There's just too much. Too many popular people on Twitter that have huge accounts that are on it all day long and monetizing it and acting as legitimate independent journalists without any sort of oversight.
Yeah, 100%. In fact, it's not just that. They were using social media to support, CIA, intelligence community, Defense Department were using social media for Arab Spring, for the color revolutions in Eastern Europe. It was a weapon. It was part of what they call hybrid warfare. Getting people, mobilizing people in the streets to do regime change, to overthrow governments. If you can, the holy grail for, it's like Sun Tzu, the best way to win is by not having to fight,
Right.
And so if you can not have to fire any bullets, CIA 1.0 after World War II, it's a crude military overthrow of governments. CIA 2.0 regime change is you put a bunch of people in the street, peaceful protest, get the head of state to resign or call an early election, and then overthrow the government that way. So social media was a tool of U.S. government statecraft for whatever that period was, when Arab Spring 2011 until 2016. And then I think it was basically Brexit. Duterte in Philippines is another right-wing populist that gets elected. Trump. And even though I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming that Trump was not elected because of social media, he was elected because he defeated his opponents and his Republican opponents in the debates, and then defeated Hillary in the election, mostly through conventional media. His use of social media and those other things clearly triggered a reaction from these deep state organizations. I like it. It's funny. I just read this beautiful history of the printing press in Oxford history, and the printing press at first, 15th century, first 100 years, the Catholic Church is just like, we love the printing press. We're just cranking out Bibles and it's going great. And then Martin Luther gets a hold of the printing press and prints his theses, which are mostly attacking the church for corruption, for selling indulgences as a way to pay for your sins, basically. And he condemns that. And he literally goes viral. I mean, when you read like that history, you're like, it's eerily similar to social media. I mean, it's amazing because, well, anyway, long story short, there's like a long period of revolutions and wars and the Protestant Reformation and then the Counter-Reformation. And they're like the printing presses, they're like hiding them in people's houses. The church and the government is arresting people for having printing presses. The printing presses go to Netherlands. They're sneaking the printing presses into the Netherlands. And so it's like, you can't help but see it. You're like, wow, it's like VPNs. Because in Brazil, when they were like, we're going to ban X, we're like, get a VPN, and VPN in. Mm-hmm. Still hard for people to post publicly because that would obviously show that they were on it. But still, it's like you're always, and this is sort of an argument, this would be an argument for Elon to cut a deal to get X back up in Brazil. And I'm not saying that's what he should do. I'm just saying one argument for it is that, stay in the game. Don't let them confiscate your printing press out of principle or pride, because at some other point, you're going to be able to find a way to work around that censorship.
Does Brazil have something similar to our First Amendment?
They have a line in their constitution that is extremely strong, that there should be no censorship for social or political issues. The problem is that their constitution is so long and it was created by so many people that there's then all these other caveats. Like you can't engage in racism, you can't engage in hate, you can't, the Nazi Party is banned in Brazil. So there's all sorts of other things the Constitution is full of contradictions. It's a huge problem. It made me, the whole experience, by the way, because, when you're growing up and you grow up and you go to elementary school and high school, and the teachers are telling you the Constitution of the United States is so special, and you're just like, oh, come on, like whatever. But you realize when you get older and you realize the First Amendment, it's so radical, because basically every other country in the world, certainly every other Western country, the progression of free speech was you would ask the king for permission. He was like, oh, king, can we criticize you for this? And he'd be like, oh, okay, we'll allow you to do that. But free speech was something gradually granted to the people. Here, as soon as they get the Constitution done, Jefferson and other anti-federalists, the people that were pretty skeptical about even wanting a country, were like, we need a Bill of Rights, and the first thing up there, it needs to be free speech, and it's without qualifications. So the First Amendment doesn't say except for libel and defamation and imminent incitement of violence. Right. Those things were Supreme Court rulings in the 250 years after the Constitution was ratified in 1789. And so that's why it's so amazing, is that like you just never, this history I just read of free speech is so amazing, because like you get all these battles over how much free speech to have. Is it just for the elites? Is it for the people? Then you get to the United States, and it's just a clear moment in history where the founders of this country were just like, fuck it. Like, this is essential. Like, the speech comes before the government. The government, you don't have a government and then have free speech. We have free speech as an inalienable right from God or from our Creator, or just something that we're saying that we have. And then you make a government based on speech. So this Orwellian idea that we hear, including, tragically, from Barack Obama and now his two secretaries of state, John Kerry and Hillary Clinton, and Bill Gates, they're saying we have to have censorship to protect democracy. It's like the most Orwellian, un-American idea. It's anathema. How
is Bill Gates in this conversation at all? That's what's confusing. A non-elected official who just owned a software company.